Some family secrets are buried so deep that when they finally surface, they bring something else up with them. Something that should have stayed buried forever. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in the abandoned coal mines north of Cucumber, West Virginia, and I swear on my father's missing soul that every word of it is true. Let me start with this. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be hunted by someone you love, someone you trust completely, then you'll understand why I've kept this story locked away for over 20 years. But lately, the nightmares have been getting worse, and my therapist says that maybe it's time I finally told someone what really happened in those tunnels. You see, this story begins when I was 9 years old, sitting at our old oak kitchen table, while my mother and grandfather delivered the kind of news that splits a child's world in half. My father had vanished without a trace during what should have been a routine hunting trip with my Uncle Lee. One minute, he was there, walking back to retrieve a forgotten duck call from his truck, and the next minute, he had simply ceased to exist. But here's what makes this disappearance different from all the others you might have heard about. My father didn't just vanish from some random stretch of wilderness. He disappeared near a place that locals had been avoiding for decades. A network of abandoned coal mines that had been hastily sealed after a series of unexplained accidents in the 1960s. The kind of place where even experienced miners refused to work, claiming they heard voices in the tunnels that had no business being there. The initial search effort was massive by small-town standards. Every deputy from McDowell County Sheriff's Department combed those hills for 2 solid weeks. They brought in tracking dogs, cave rescue specialists, even a helicopter from Charleston. But after 14 days of finding absolutely nothing, not even a torn piece of clothing or a dropped cigarette butt, the sheriff had no choice but to call it off. My mother, bless her heart, refused to give up. She kept my father's name on the missing persons registry and scraped together every penny she could find to hire a private investigator. This wasn't just any PEI either. He was a retired detective from Charleston with 30 years of experience and a reputation for solving cases that other people had given up on. If anyone could find my father, it would be him. For 6 months, this investigator turned over every stone in a 50-mile radius. He interviewed dozens of people, re-examined every piece of evidence, and even brought in his own team of cave specialists to explore areas the county search and rescue teams couldn't reach safely. But in the end, all he could offer my mother was the same theory everyone else had. My father had most likely fallen into one of those old mining shafts, and his body was lying at the bottom of some flooded tunnel that would never be found. But here's where the story gets interesting, and why I think you'll want to keep listening. The private investigator did find something in those mines, something he mentioned almost in passing that would haunt me for the next 13 years. Deep in one of the tunnels, sprayed across the walls in what looked like black paint, were symbols and writing that he couldn't identify. Not graffiti, not gang tags, but something else entirely. Something older. The investigator assumed it was just local kids using the abandoned mines as a hangout spot, but he took photos of the markings anyway. When he showed them to experts at West Virginia University, not one of them could identify the language or symbols. They weren't Native American, they weren't any form of European script, and they definitely weren't anything that belonged in a coal mine that had been abandoned in the 1960s. Now, you might be wondering why this detail is so important, and trust me, it becomes crucial later in the story. But first, let me tell you about the effect my father's disappearance had on our family, particularly on Uncle Lee. Lee was my father's younger brother, only about 3 years between them, and they'd been inseparable since childhood. They hunted together, fished together, worked on cars together. They were more like best friends than siblings. So, when my father vanished on Lee's watch, it absolutely destroyed him. The guilt ate away at him like acid. Everyone kept telling Uncle Lee that it wasn't his fault, that he'd done everything right, that there was no way he could have prevented whatever happened. But Lee never bought it. He became obsessed with that hunting trip, replaying every moment in his mind, wondering if he'd missed some crucial detail that might have saved his brother's life. Over the years, Lee became increasingly isolated. He'd show up for birthdays and holidays, but you could see the pain written all over his face every time he looked at me and my sister. My mother told us later that I reminded Lee so much of my father at that age that it was physically painful for him to be around me. Can you imagine carrying that kind of burden? Loving someone but being unable to be near them because they remind you of your greatest failure? What I didn't know at the time, what none of us knew, was that Uncle Lee had been making regular trips back to those mines. Not just once or twice, but dozens of times over the years. Always alone, always searching for something that might explain what happened to his brother. And, according to what he told me years later, each visit left him feeling more disturbed and more convinced that the official explanation was wrong. Fast forward to when I turned 22. I was working at an auto repair shop in Welch, living in a small apartment above the garage, trying to build some kind of adult life, despite having this massive hole where my father should have been. My sister had gone off to college in Morgantown, and honestly, our little family felt more fractured than ever. That's when Uncle Lee reached out. After nearly 5 years of minimal contact, he called my mother and asked if he could speak with me. Not just a phone call, but an actual face-to-face meeting. My mother was thrilled. She'd been worried about Lee for years and thought that maybe reconnecting with family might help him heal. I drove out to his place near Filbert on a Saturday afternoon, not knowing what to expect. Would he be the same Uncle Lee I remembered from childhood? Or had the years of guilt and isolation changed him into someone else entirely? When he opened the door, I was relieved to see that he looked healthy, clear-eyed, and genuinely happy to see me. We spent hours catching up, sharing stories about work, talking about my sister's college adventures, carefully dancing around the elephant in the room. Lee had always been a great storyteller, and that afternoon he was in rare form, regaling me with tales from his job at the lumber mill and his attempts at learning to cook for himself. But eventually, inevitably, the conversation turned to my father. And that's when Uncle Lee made a proposal that would change everything. He suggested that we visit the site where my father had disappeared. Not for some morbid reason, he assured me, but for closure. Lee told me that he'd been hiking those hills regularly over the years, and while he'd never found any trace of my father, the visits had helped him process the guilt and grief that had been eating him alive. My initial reaction was absolute horror. The idea of deliberately going to the place where my father had vanished seemed like emotional masochism. Why would I want to torture myself that way? But Lee was patient, and over the course of nearly a year of regular visits, he gradually convinced me that confronting that place might be exactly what I needed. You have to understand, I've been carrying my own burden of unresolved grief for 13 years. I'd never had a funeral to attend, never had a grave to visit, never had any kind of concrete closure. My father had simply evaporated from existence, leaving behind nothing but questions and a family torn apart by uncertainty. So eventually, I agreed. we planned a hiking trip for early May, when the weather would be pleasant and the spring foliage would make the woods beautiful rather than forbidding. We decided to treat it like a regular outdoor adventure. Pack some sandwiches, bring a few beers, and just enjoy spending time together in nature. If I wanted to talk about my father or ask questions about that day, we could cross that bridge when we came to it. The morning of our hike, I felt surprisingly calm. The drive out to the trailhead took us along a winding creek road, past farmhouses and trailer parks, through the kind of rural landscape that defines Appalachian West Virginia. Lee was in good spirits, pointing out landmarks and sharing memories from his childhood spent exploring these same hills with my father. When we reached the parking area, really just a widened shoulder on a backcountry road, I felt that first flutter of anxiety. This was it. I was actually going to the place where my father had disappeared. But Lee seemed to sense my nervousness and immediately started talking about the local wildlife, the geological formations, anything to keep my mind occupied as we shouldered our day packs and headed into the woods. The first hour of hiking was actually pleasant. The trail was well maintained, the conversation flowed naturally, and I began to think that maybe this had been a good idea after all. These weren't haunted woods filled with the ghost of my father. They were just trees and rocks and streams, no different from dozens of other places I'd hiked over the years. But that sense of normalcy was deceptive, and I think part of me knew it. Because while the woods themselves seemed ordinary, there was something else there. Something I couldn't quite name. It was like walking through a house where you know someone is watching you from another room, even though you can't see them. We reached Big Creek around midday and settled down on a flat boulder to eat lunch and rest our feet. The spot was beautiful. Clear water running over smooth stones, sunlight filtering through the canopy, the kind of place you'd take your family for a picnic. As we sat there, sharing sandwiches and cold beer, I felt genuinely grateful for Uncle Lee's patience in bringing me here. That's when I suggested we head back to the truck. I'd seen the place, I'd conquered my fear, and I was ready to call it a successful day. But Lee had other plans. He told me there was something else he wanted to show me, something important. We hiked for another mile or so through increasingly dense forest until we reached a rocky outcropping that provided a perfect view of the valley below. And that's when I saw them for the first time, the abandoned mines of Cucumber Hollow. From our vantage point, they looked like black scars in the hillside, dark openings that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Some were partially collapsed, others had been sealed with concrete barriers, but several were still open, gaping wounds in the earth that had been festering for decades. That's where the private investigator searched, Lee told me, his voice suddenly heavy with emotion he'd been hiding all day. Every tunnel that could be safely explored, every shaft that wasn't flooded or collapsed, they mapped every inch of those mines looking for your father. And then he dropped the bombshell that changed everything. "There's something I never told you or your mother," he said, staring down at those dark openings. "Something I told the sheriff and the PI but couldn't bear to share with family. The last time I saw your father, he was walking into one of those mines." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. For 13 years, I'd believed that my father had simply gotten lost in the woods, that he'd suffered some kind of accident or medical emergency that left him unable to find his way back. But, according to Uncle Lee, my father had deliberately entered those mines, and Uncle Lee had seen him do it. Lee's story was both more detailed and more disturbing than anything I'd heard before. After noticing my father was missing, Lee had spent over an hour searching the immediate area, calling out and following what he thought might be tracks. Eventually, his search brought him to this exact outcropping, where he'd spotted a distant figure dressed exactly like my father, walking purposefully toward one of the mine entrances. Lee said he'd scrambled down the steep incline and run to the mine entrance, but when he arrived with his flashlight in hand, there was no one there. He'd called out my father's name dozens of times but received no response. The tunnel seemed to swallow his voice completely. There was something about that place, Lee told me, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke, something that made every instinct I had scream at me to get out. But I couldn't leave, not when Stanley might have been in there, hurt or trapped. Lee had spent another hour searching that tunnel, going as deep as he dared with just a small flashlight for guidance. But he'd found nothing except an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to grow stronger the deeper he went. Eventually, he'd been forced to retreat and call for help. But here's the part that still gives me chills. Lee swore that during his search of that tunnel, he'd heard footsteps other than his own. Not the echo of his own movements, but deliberate, measured steps that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the mine. When he'd call out my father's name, the footsteps would stop. When he'd move forward, they'd resume, always staying just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. As Lee told me this story, staring down at those black holes in the hillside, I realized that my understanding of my father's disappearance had been completely wrong. This wasn't a case of a man getting lost in the woods. This was something far more disturbing and inexplicable. But the story was about to get even stranger. Lee asked if I wanted to visit the mine with him. Not to search for my father. He'd long since accepted that any physical evidence was gone, but as a way of confronting the place that had been haunting both of us for over a decade. He told me that he made these pilgrimages regularly, that facing the sight of his worst failure had become a necessary part of his healing process. I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea. But there was something compelling about the prospect of finally seeing the place where my father had last been sighted, of touching the same stone walls he might have touched in his final moments. So I agreed, and we began our descent into Cucumber Hollow. Getting down to the mines required a treacherous hike down the steep face of the outcropping. The path, if you could call it that, was little more than a series of natural ledges and handholds carved by decades of erosion. One wrong step would have sent either of us tumbling down a 100-foot drop onto jagged rocks below. At the bottom of the hollow, the atmosphere changed completely. The air was noticeably cooler, almost cold despite the warm May afternoon above. The sound of our footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was thicker down there. And everywhere you looked, there were warning signs, dozens of them, hammered into the dirt and nailed to fence posts, all variations on the same theme. Danger, keep out, unstable ground, toxic gases, death possible. The signs weren't old either. Some of them looked like they'd been placed recently, suggesting that people were still trying to explore these mines despite the obvious dangers. I asked Lee about this, and he told me that urban explorers and thrill seekers had been drawn to the cucumber mines for years, despite the risks. Most of them, he said, didn't stay long. As we approached the entrance to the mine where Lee had last seen my father, I noticed something that the view from above hadn't revealed. The opening wasn't just a hole in the hillside. It was framed by what looked like a massive iron gate, rusted and twisted but still imposing. The gate stood partially open, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and beyond it stretched a tunnel that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Are you sure about this?" Lee asked me, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "We don't have to go inside. Just being here, just seeing the place, that might be enough." But I'd come too far to turn back now. Besides, I had questions that could only be answered by seeing the inside of that tunnel for myself. What had drawn my father into that darkness? What had he seen or heard that made him leave the safety of the woods and enter a place that every sign warned against? The moment I stepped through that iron gate, I understood why the mines had such a sinister reputation. The temperature drop was immediate and dramatic, like walking into a walk-in freezer. The air had a distinct smell, not just the musty odor you'd expect from an old tunnel, but something else underneath it. Something organic and wrong, like meat that had been left to spoil in a sealed container. My small keychain flashlight created a pathetic circle of illumination that barely extended beyond arm's reach. The tunnel walls were rough-hewn stone, scarred by decades of dynamite blasting and pickaxe work. Water dripped constantly from somewhere overhead, creating an irregular percussion that echoed strangely in the confined space. But it was the silence between the drips that was most unsettling. In most caves or tunnels, you can hear the subtle sounds of air movement, the settling of rock, the distant noise of the outside world. Here, there was nothing. It was as if the tunnel existed in its own pocket of reality, cut off from the normal flow of sound and sensation. I'd taken maybe 20 steps into the tunnel when I realized that Uncle Lee hadn't followed me. I turned around, expecting to see him a few feet behind me, but instead, I saw his silhouette framed in the entrance, nearly 50 feet away. He was standing perfectly still, and something about his posture made my stomach clench with sudden fear. That's when I saw what he was holding in his hand. The gun wasn't pointed at me, not yet, but it was there, solid and real and completely unexpected. Lee had never mentioned bringing a weapon on our hike, and seeing it in his hand transformed everything I thought I knew about our situation. "Uncle Lee," I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the tunnel. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, silhouetted against the entrance, holding that pistol in a hand that was trembling so badly I could see it shaken even from 50 feet away. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't know Uncle Lee at all. The man who had raised me after my father disappeared, who had been my mentor and father figure, was pointing a gun in my direction for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. The first shot came without warning. The muzzle flash lit up the tunnel like lightning, and the sound was so loud in that confined space that I thought my eardrums had ruptured. The bullet struck the tunnel wall somewhere behind me, sending chips of stone flying, and in that instant, I understood that this wasn't a warning shot or an accident. Uncle Lee was trying to kill me. I ran. I'd never run so fast in my entire life, plunging deeper into that tunnel with my inadequate flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me. Behind me, I could hear Lee's footsteps echoing as he gave chase, punctuated by more gunshots that sent bullets ricocheting off the stone walls like deadly pinballs. The only way to avoid becoming an easy target was to turn off my flashlight and navigate by memory and instinct. But that meant running full speed through absolute darkness, in an abandoned mine filled with potential hazards, while being hunted by someone who clearly wanted me dead. The terror was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the complete shattering of reality that came with realizing that someone you loved and trusted was hunting you like an animal. My mind kept trying to find some explanation, some rational reason why Uncle Lee would suddenly turn violent, but there was nothing. Nothing that made sense. As I ran, my flashlight beam occasionally caught glimpses of the tunnel walls, and what I saw there made me question my sanity. The writing that the private investigator had mentioned wasn't just in one section. It covered every available surface. Symbols and words in a script that looked almost organic, as if it had grown on the walls rather than been painted there. But I didn't have time to study it. Lee's voice was getting closer, and he was calling out to me, telling me to stop running, that this would all be over soon if I just cooperated. There was something in his voice that was worse than anger or madness. It was a kind of resigned determination, like he was following orders from someone else. The tunnel branched into 3 different directions, and I chose the middle path purely by instinct. As I ran down this new passage, the walls seemed to close in around me, and the strange writing became even more dense. It was everywhere now, covering every inch of available surface, and in the brief moments when my flashlight illuminated it, the symbols seemed to writhe and shift in ways that made my eyes water. That's when I found the chamber. It was larger than I'd expected, a natural cavern that the miners had expanded into a storage area, or perhaps a rest station. Old equipment was scattered around. Rusted tools, broken lanterns, coils of rope that had rotted away to nothing. But it was the far wall of the chamber that made me stop dead in my tracks. The entire surface was covered in that same strange script, but here it was different. More elaborate, more intentional. And, in the center of it all, carved deep into the stone rather than painted on the surface, was a symbol that made my blood run cold. It looked like a doorway, but wrong somehow, with angles that didn't quite make sense and proportions that hurt to look at directly. I'd found my hiding place, but I'd also found something else. Something that made me understand why the mines had been abandoned so hastily, why the private investigator had felt uneasy, why Uncle Lee had been making secret pilgrimages to this place for over a decade. As I crouched in the darkest corner of the chamber, listening to Lee's footsteps getting closer, I heard him start to speak. But he wasn't talking to me anymore. "I brought him," Lee said, his voice echoing through the tunnels. "Just like you wanted. Stanley's boy's here." Stanley. That was my father's name, and Lee was talking to someone, or something, as if they were having a conversation, but I could only hear one side of it. That's when the air changed. A warm breeze began flowing through the tunnels, carrying with it a smell that defied description. It wasn't the organic decay you'd expect in an old mine. It was something else entirely. Something that smelled like burnt copper and sulfur, and underneath it all, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. Lee's voice became more agitated, more desperate. "I've been coming here for years," he said. "I've done everything you asked. I brought his tools, I brought his clothes, I even brought his wedding ring. And now I'm bringing you his son. You have to let Stanley go now. You have to let him come home." The temperature in the chamber dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. And that's when I heard it. Not Lee's voice, not his footsteps, but something else moving in the tunnels. Something large and deliberate that shouldn't have been there. Lee's voice changed then, becoming high and panicked. No, he said. "That wasn't the deal. I brought him here like you wanted. You said you'd let Stanley go if I brought his boy." And then Lee began to scream. It wasn't the scream of someone in physical pain. It was the sound of someone experiencing absolute, mind-breaking terror. The kind of scream that comes from seeing something that shouldn't exist. Something that violates every natural law and renders the human mind temporarily incapable of processing reality. I ran again. I burst out of that chamber and sprinted back down the tunnel, following my earlier path in reverse, guided only by the distant glow of the mine entrance. Behind me, Lee's screams continued, echoing through the tunnels in ways that seemed to multiply and distort them until it sounded like a dozen people screaming in harmony. But underneath the screaming, I could hear something else. Footsteps. Not Lee's familiar boot steps, but something that sounded like bare feet slapping against wet stone. And they were following me. I reached the main tunnel and saw the entrance ahead of me. A rectangle of blessed daylight that represented safety and sanity and escape from whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into. But as I ran toward it, I could hear those wet footsteps getting closer, and I could smell that awful sulfur and copper stench getting stronger. 20 feet from the entrance, my flashlight died. Not just dimmed, died completely, leaving me in absolute darkness with something pursuing me through tunnels that reeked of hell itself. I ran blind, guided only by the distant rectangle of light, waiting for claws or teeth, or worse, to tear into my back. I burst out of that mine entrance like a man escaping from his own grave. The sunlight was so bright after the darkness that I was temporarily blinded, but I kept running anyway, scrambling up the steep sides of the hollow, pulling myself up by tree roots and rock outcroppings until I reached the main trail. Behind me, Lee's screams had stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the screaming had been. At least when I could hear him, I knew he was still alive, still human. The silence suggested something else entirely. I ran through those woods until my legs gave out, then walked until I could run again, then repeated the process until I finally saw the glint of my truck's metal bed through the trees. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and when I finally got the engine started, I sat there for several minutes trying to process what had just happened to me. Had Uncle Lee really tried to kill me? Had I really heard him talking to something in those tunnels? And what had happened to him after his scream stopped? I made it as far as the town of Quetta before I had to stop. There was no way I could drive safely in my condition, and I needed to call the sheriff's department to report what had happened. The motel receptionist took one look at me and probably thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but she let me use their phone anyway. The call was surreal. How do you explain to a police dispatcher that your uncle tried to murder you in an abandoned mine while apparently talking to invisible entities? How do you convey the sense of supernatural dread without sounding like you've lost your mind? I told them the basic facts. Uncle Lee had brought a gun on our hike, had tried to shoot me in the mine, and was still down there as far as I knew. I mentioned hearing him scream, but I didn't elaborate on the context. Some details I realized were better left unsaid. 2 deputies arrived at the motel within 15 minutes, and I told them my story in more detail. They took extensive notes, asked pointed questions about Lee's behavior and mental state, and assured me that they'd investigate immediately. Then they told me to go home and wait for their call. The wait was agony. I sat in my apartment, replaying every moment of that day, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had Lee planned this from the beginning? Or had something in those mines triggered a psychological break? Why had he called me Stanley? And what had made him scream like that? The call came 6 hours later. The deputies had found evidence of the shooting, shell casings near the mine entrance and bullet holes in the tunnel walls that corroborated my story. But they hadn't found Uncle Lee. The search and rescue operation that followed was depressingly familiar. The same teams that had searched for my father 13 years earlier were called in to search for Uncle Lee. Cave specialists, tracking dogs, volunteers from neighboring counties, everyone who had expertise in this type of operation. But just like with my father, they found nothing. The official explanation, when it finally came, was almost laughable in its inadequacy. According to the county sheriff, Lee and I had been victims of a gas blowout, a sudden release of toxic fumes that had caused hallucinations and violent behavior. Lee's disappearance was attributed to disorientation caused by gas poisoning, and his failure to emerge from the mines was explained as either accidental death by gas exposure or fall trauma. But I knew better. I'd heard Lee talking to something in those tunnels, something that had been waiting for him to bring me there, something that had been holding my father for 13 years and wanted to add me to its collection. The mine was sealed with explosives a month later, officially for public safety reasons. But I think the real reason was that too many of the search and rescue personnel had reported feeling uneasy in those tunnels. Too many of them had heard sounds that couldn't be explained, seen shadows that moved independently of any light source. That was 23 years ago, and I've never been back to Cucumber Hollow. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 years ago, something happened that proved my worst fears about those mines were absolutely justified. A team of urban explorers managed to break through the sealed entrance and posted videos of their expedition online. The footage shows them exploring several of the main tunnels, joking and laughing as they document the old mining equipment and geological formations. But about 40 minutes into their video, they reach the chamber I'd hidden in all those years ago. The carved symbol on the far wall is still there, exactly as I remembered it. But something else is there too. Something that makes my hands shake every time I think about it. In the corner where I'd crouched in terror while Uncle Lee hunted me, there's a pile of personal effects. Wallets, watches, jewelry, car keys, dozens of items that clearly belong to different people from different time periods, and sitting on top of the pile, perfectly preserved despite the decades in that damp tunnel, is my father's hunting jacket. The urban explorers didn't stay long after finding that collection. Their joking and laughter stopped completely, and the rest of their video shows them leaving the mines as quickly as possible. But they captured enough footage to prove that whatever took my father and Uncle Lee is still down there, still collecting. The video was removed from the internet within days of being posted, and when I tried to contact the people who made it, I found that their social media accounts had all been deleted. It's as if they vanished as completely as my father and uncle had. But I managed to save a copy of that video before it disappeared, and sometimes, late at night when the nightmares are particularly bad, I watch it again. I study that pile of personal effects, looking for clues about the other people who've disappeared in those mines over the years. Because my father and Uncle Lee weren't the first, and I have a horrible feeling they won't be the last. There's something down there in the darkness beneath Cucumber Hollow, something that's been feeding on the people who ventured too deep into those tunnels. Something that somehow convinced my Uncle Lee to bring me there as an offering, just like it probably convinced my father to walk into that mine 26 years ago. I've spent years researching the history of those mines, trying to understand what could have caused such an accumulation of disappearances. The official records show that the Cucumber mines were abandoned in 1967 after a series of accidents that killed 17 miners over the course of just 6 months. But the unofficial stories, the ones you only hear if you buy enough drinks for old-timers in local bars, tell a different tale entirely. According to local folklore, the miners had dug too deep, breaking through into something that should have been left sealed. They'd found chambers that weren't on any geological survey, tunnels that seemed to have been carved by something other than human hands. And in the deepest parts of the mine, they'd discovered writing on the walls, the same strange script that I'd seen during my brief time in those tunnels. The miners had tried to keep working despite the growing sense of unease, but then people started disappearing. Not in mining accidents, but simply vanishing during their shifts. They'd be seen entering a particular tunnel and would never come out. Search parties would find their equipment, sometimes their clothes, but never the miners themselves. The company that owned the mines tried to cover up the disappearances, claiming they were safety violations and worker negligence. But when 3 more miners vanished in a single week, the remaining workers refused to go back underground. The mines were hastily abandoned, and according to the stories I've heard, the company executives were so eager to distance themselves from the site that they sold it to the county for $1 just to get it off their books. That's when the real nightmare began. Over the following decades, the sealed mines became a magnet for people who didn't come back. Hikers, hunters, urban explorers, even county officials who went to inspect the site. They'd venture into those tunnels and simply disappear. The pattern was always the same. Personal effects left behind, no signs of violence or struggle, and absolutely no trace of the missing person. But here's the detail that made me understand the true scope of what we're dealing with. Every single disappearance was preceded by the same phenomenon that Uncle Lee and I experienced. Witnesses would report seeing the missing person walking deliberately toward the mine entrances, often in response to hearing their name called from the darkness. My father hadn't gotten lost in the woods. He'd been summoned. And 26 years later, Uncle Lee had answered the same call, bringing me along as some kind of tribute or offering to whatever was waiting in those depths. I know how this sounds. I know that every rational person listening to this story will have perfectly logical explanations for everything I've described. Gas poisoning, psychological breaks, coincidental disappearances. There are scientific reasons for all of it. But I also know what I experienced in those tunnels, and I know that some things can't be explained by science. There's something ancient and hungry living in the abandoned mines of Cucumber Hollow, something that feeds on human suffering and has learned to lure people into its domain by mimicking the voices of their loved ones. It took my father when I was 9 years old. It tried to take me when I was 22, and it succeeded in claiming Uncle Lee as some kind of consolation prize. The worst part? I think it's still down there, still waiting, still collecting the personal effects of people who ventured too close to its domain. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if my father and Uncle Lee are still alive down there in the darkness, serving whatever entity has claimed them, helping it lure new victims into its web. I'm telling you this story not because I expect you to believe it, but because I need someone else to know the truth about what happened to my family. And maybe, just maybe, because I want to warn anyone who might be thinking about exploring those mines that some doors should never be opened, some tunnels should never be entered, and some family mysteries are better left unsolved. Because the thing about darkness isn't just that it hides what's there. Sometimes it hides what's waiting for you to join it. And in the abandoned mines of Cucumber Hollow, something is always waiting. Story 2, What if I told you that in the remote mountains of Appalachia, there exists a secret that could change everything we think we know about human longevity? What if I told you that I've seen it with my own eyes, and it's something I wish I could forget? My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill's Department of Anthropology. For the past 6 years, I've dedicated my career to studying the intersection of cultural practices and social identity, with a particular emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. In simpler terms, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and examining their past. I've undertaken numerous fascinating projects during my time in academia, and while most have been both intellectually enriching and personally satisfying, there's one research expedition that I frankly wish I could erase from my memory entirely, and that's not because of the subject matter, nor the people I encountered during my fieldwork. In fact, I cannot speak highly enough of either. Rather, it's because of a very particular encounter with a very particular woman that left me questioning not just my research, but the very nature of reality itself. Let me take you back to the beginning. I was researching the kinship networks, ritual traditions, and sociocultural resilience of the Melungeon Appalachians. For those unfamiliar with this remarkable group, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the mountainous region where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to possess a unique blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries, with origins that historians trace back to the late 18th century, though some evidence suggests they may have been there even earlier. The term Melungeon itself comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was historically applied to those who lived in relative isolation in remote areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeon people remain one of America's most hotly debated ethnographic mysteries, with theories ranging from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors and lost colony survivors to complex unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee and Saponi. Recent genetic studies, including groundbreaking research published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, suggest that many Melungeons have deep roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly stemming from early colonial interactions that occurred before strict racial classification laws had been established in the Americas. Physical traits commonly associated with Melungeon heritage include dark hair, striking light eyes, and what researchers have termed the Melungeon bump dash, a distinctive ridge on the back of the skull. However, appearances are known to vary widely among families and across generations. Over the centuries, many Melungeons have gradually assimilated into broader American populations. But in recent decades, it's become increasingly common for their descendants to embrace and celebrate their unique ancestry through organizations like the Melungeon Heritage Association. These groups work to preserve and honor a complex cultural identity that fundamentally challenges what have traditionally been rigid racial categories in American society. Undertaking research into the Melungeon community seemed like an incredible professional opportunity. In anthropology, it's exceedingly rare to discover a research subject that doesn't require a 14-hour international flight and a phrase book, so I was absolutely overjoyed when I received news that my research proposal had been accepted for funding. But if I had known what I was going to encounter in those ancient mountains, there's no way in hell I would ever have honored that acceptance. And this is exactly why. I remember driving along that winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling ominously over the loose gravel as I wondered if my faithful car was finally going to give up the ghost before I reached my destination. The latest research thread I had been following led me to a village called Hollow Ridge, a place that, depending on which historical account you studied, wasn't even supposed to exist on modern maps. Some particularly intriguing accounts I had uncovered made the rather extraordinary claim that the town's population manifested what could only be described as an atypical aging process, one that completely defied conventional physiological expectations. Or, to phrase it exactly like the remarkably friendly lady at the roadside diner had told me when I stopped for directions, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time, honey. My research notebooks were absolutely stuffed with dead ends and false leads by this point, so I figured there was certainly no harm in chasing down this particular thread, no matter how unlikely it seemed. After what felt like hours of treacherous mountain driving, Hollow Ridge finally materialized before me like something from another century. Weathered clapboard houses sagged precariously against the steep hillside, thin columns of smoke curled lazily from stone chimneys, and a handful of locals lingered on their front porches, watching with obvious curiosity as my obviously out-of-place vehicle rolled slowly into their domain. I parked near what appeared to be the village's only general store, grabbed my research bag and stepped out to breathe mountain air that carried the rich scents of damp earth, pine oil, and something indefinably ancient. A man in faded overalls nodded at me from across the narrow street, and I quietly returned his greeting before heading inside the store to begin my inquiries. The store clerk, a wiry gentleman with graying hair and suspicious eyes, regarded me with obvious mistrust when I began asking questions about the village's history and demographics. I explained that I was a genealogist tracking Melungeon bloodlines for academic purposes, and he frowned deeply, giving me another long, calculating look before reluctantly pointing toward a dirt path that led up the steep ridge behind the store. "Folks up there don't take kindly to outsiders," he warned me in a voice that carried decades of mountain wisdom. "You'd better mind yourself up there, miss." I thanked him sincerely, purchased a Coca-Cola and a pack of gum, and then began the challenging trek toward the ridge. The path climbed deeply through increasingly thick woods, my boots crunching rhythmically on fallen leaves and dried twigs. It was genuinely tough going, but after approximately a mile of steady climbing, I emerged into a small clearing containing a cluster of houses that appeared smaller, older, and somehow more isolated than those in the village below. A middle-aged woman sat peacefully on her front porch, methodically shelling fresh peas into a worn wooden bowl. She looked up as I approached, her dark eyes steady and penetrating as I introduced myself and explained that I was researching family histories for academic purposes. She didn't smile or offer any pleasantries. Instead, she simply jerked her head toward the house directly behind her. "Mama's inside," she said matter-of-factly. "She's the one you want to talk to." I stepped up onto the creaking wooden porch, and before I could even raise my hand to knock, the front door groaned open to reveal two tall men standing in the doorway. Both appeared to be in their 60s or 70s, with deeply weathered skin and pure white hair, and they looked so similar they could easily have been brothers. They didn't invite me inside, they didn't bother asking what I wanted. They simply stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, until I took the initiative to explain my presence. I kept my explanation simple and professional, focusing on my academic credentials and research objectives. The slightly shorter man, who bore a distinctive scar across his left cheek, finally spoke. "Mama's 112 years old," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. "She don't talk much these days and she tires easily. Don't you go wearing her out." The other man nodded gravely, and then both stepped aside, beckoning me into their home with obvious reluctance. The interior of the house immediately assaulted my senses with the overwhelming smell of mildew and persistent wood smoke. The dim living room was illuminated by nothing more than a single electric lamp positioned in the far corner, casting long, dancing shadows across the worn wooden floors. There, lying in what appeared to be a hospital bed, was a woman, or at least what remained of one. When I say that she was skeletal, I mean that in the most literal sense imaginable. Her skin was stretched so impossibly tight over her protruding bones that it seemed like the slightest touch would cause it to tear and bleed. Her eyes had sunk so far back into their sockets that they appeared to be staring out from dark caves, giving her an appearance that was nothing short of spectral. Her hair hung in thin, brittle white strands that looked ready to crumble at any moment, and her hands rested beside her like withered claws, the knuckles grotesquely prominent beneath translucent skin. Most disturbing of all was her breathing, which sounded exactly like someone trying to draw air through a windpipe that had been lined with coarse sandpaper. I had certainly encountered elderly individuals before in my research, but this woman was something else entirely. Something that challenged every assumption I had about human aging and survival. As I carefully seated myself on the wooden stool that one of her sons dragged over for me, she exhibited absolutely no reaction to my presence whatsoever. No acknowledgement, no curiosity, no recognition that another person had entered her space. Nothing. I started with the simplest possible questions, keeping my voice gentle and respectful. When I asked her name and received no response, one of her sons whispered, "Oneida," from somewhere behind me in the shadowy room. I then asked where her people had originally come from, but she offered no answer, her unfocused gaze remaining locked on some point in the near distance, unblinking and seemingly unseeing. I tried asking about her parents, her childhood, her memories of the early days in Hollow Ridge, but still received nothing. Her sons hovered nearby like protective sentinels, their muscled arms crossed as they watched my every movement with growing suspicion. "She's weak today," one of them eventually said, his voice carrying a clear warning. "Don't you go pushing her too hard now." I assured them that I understood completely and would be respectful of her condition, but my professional curiosity was absolutely burning in my chest. Here was a woman who was allegedly 112 years old, yet who looked like she had been slowly starving for decades. I simply had to know more about her extraordinary longevity. Leaning forward slightly and keeping my voice as soft and non-threatening as possible, I asked what would prove to be the most important question of my entire career. "Ma'am, how long have you lived, and how have you managed to live so long? What's your secret?" For the first time since I had entered that oppressive room, she seemed to latch on to something I had said. Her sunken eyes widened with what appeared to be recognition. Her cracked lips parted slightly, and she turned to look directly at me with an expression of pure, undiluted fear that chilled me to my very core. Then, in a faint, raspy voice that was barely above a whisper, she spoke the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "It eats the years." The tremendous strain of forcing out those 4 simple words looked like it was literally killing her. When she finished speaking, her eyes rolled back alarmingly in their sockets. Her frail body jerked weakly against the thin mattress, and she began gasping desperately for air like someone drowning on dry land. Her sons immediately rushed to her bedside, one of them shouting for me to get out, while the other tended frantically to his mother's distress. I grabbed my research bag and stumbled outside, my heart hammering against my ribs as the front door slammed shut behind me with finality. As I walked back down toward the ridgeline on unsteady legs, the old woman's cryptic words echoed endlessly around my skull like a mantra I couldn't escape. It eats the years. What in the world could she possibly have meant by that? I desperately wanted to return immediately to demand proper answers and explanations, but I knew better than to overstay my welcome in such an isolated and clearly protective community. When I reached the lower part of the path, I noticed that the woman who had been shelling peas was gone, her abandoned bowl sitting empty on the porch like evidence of a hasty retreat. As I started down the mountain path, the youngest son's angry cry of "Don't come back" still rang clearly in my ears, following me like a curse through the ancient trees. When I finally reached my car, I sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour, frantically scribbling down every single detail I could remember while it was still fresh in my memory. The entire village felt fundamentally different now. Quieter, heavier, somehow more threatening than when I'd first arrived. As I drove away from Hollow Ridge, I found myself compulsively checking my rearview mirror far more frequently than usual, as if expecting to see something following me down the mountain. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat replaying the day's bizarre events over and over in my mind like a broken record. Onaida's haunting face refused to leave my thoughts, and neither would her terrifying words. I tried desperately to sleep, but the entire encounter kept replaying in vivid detail every time I closed my eyes. When I finally did manage to drift off, I experienced the most vivid and disturbing nightmare of my entire life. In the dream, it was me lying in that bed, more than a century old, croaking those same 4 words. It eats the years, into the terrified face of some young, eager researcher who had no idea what kind of horror they were about to uncover. The next morning, still deeply shaken, I called a research colleague who happened to be a close friend, a respected folklorist who had written extensively on Appalachian myths, legends, and oral traditions. I told him everything about Hollow Ridge, about Oneida, and about her cryptic final words. He went completely silent for several long seconds before audibly clearing his throat. "I've heard rumors about a village fitting that exact description," he admitted slowly. "I've never been able to confirm them because they never came with many concrete details. Just old folk tales about ancient pacts with the land itself. Mira, if what you're describing is real, such a discovery might end up being a tremendous source of professional pride for you. I'm genuinely excited to read your paper when it's finished." I thanked him for his encouragement, but after hanging up the phone, I found myself feeling even more deeply unsettled than before. As the day progressed, I discovered it was completely impossible to think about anything else. Maybe it was the way my colleague had built up my expectations, but I simply had to know more about what I had witnessed. So, approximately 1 week later, against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I drove back to that mysterious village. I parked my car in the exact same spot and walked down that same treacherous path with determination burning in my chest. But when I arrived at the village and climbed up the ridgeline to where Oneida's family home had stood, I discovered something that defied all logic and reason. No one was sitting on the porches. The houses appeared completely abandoned. There were no signs of recent habitation anywhere. I reached Oneida's family home and knocked firmly on the front door, but received no answer. However, upon discovering that the door was completely unlocked, my overwhelming curiosity got the better of my professional judgment, and I pushed it open to investigate. The living room was utterly empty. No lamp, no hospital bed, no Oneida. I methodically checked every other room in the house, but found absolutely nothing. No furniture, no personal belongings, no signs that anyone had lived there recently. It was as if the entire family had simply vanished into thin air. I walked back outside and called out loudly, hoping someone might respond, but received nothing except my own echo bouncing off the surrounding mountains. It was as if every single resident had mysteriously disappeared overnight, leaving behind only empty shells of homes and unanswered questions. Weeks passed, and I found myself actively avoiding my research. But Oneida's haunting question continued gnawing at me like a persistent wound that refused to heal. What could she possibly have meant by "it eats the years"? Obviously, it couldn't be taken literally, right? It had to be some kind of metaphor, but for what exactly? And why did speaking those words seem to terrify her so completely? I began digging obsessively through my extensive research library, cross-referencing every piece of Melungeon folklore I could locate with anything and everything I could find, specifically about Hollow Ridge. Unfortunately, I had absolutely no luck finding any relevant connections or explanations. I then engaged more systematically with the university's comprehensive archival resources, including the prestigious collections housed in the North Carolina collection at Wilson's Special Collections Library. It was there, after countless hours of painstaking research, that I finally achieved a small but potentially very significant breakthrough. Late one night, while I was elbow-deep in digitized historical documents, I discovered an old journal scan dated from the 1700s that detailed a fur trapper's first-hand account of what he called Hungry Hollow. The village he described matched Hollow Ridge perfectly in every single detail. The location, the isolation, even the suspicious nature of the residents. While the trapper didn't provide extensive detail beyond his basic description of the settlement, he stated very clearly and emphatically that the place possessed what he termed an unnatural temperament that had convinced him to avoid any return visit, regardless of the potential financial cost to his trapping business. If you assumed that my extraordinary encounter with Oneida and her protective sons made it into my official research paper, you would be absolutely incorrect. I wanted, more than anything in the world, to get to the bottom of what I had witnessed and experienced, but with nothing concrete to reference outside of my own subjective, personal experience. Attempting to publish such findings would have been academically fruitless at best and professionally detrimental at worst. So, instead of falling down what could easily become a rabbit hole of spurious and unverifiable claims, I made the difficult decision that the most responsible course of action was to simply try my best to forget about the entire incident and move forward with more conventional research projects. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. I can't forget. No matter how hard I try to rationalize what Oneida said to me, no matter how many logical explanations I attempt to construct, there's still something deeply, fundamentally unsettling about the way she reacted while speaking those words. I wouldn't claim to have spent extensive time around the elderly or the senile, not as much as some other researchers in my field, but I feel confident in my ability to distinguish between the typical confusion and occasional fright that accompanies slowly losing one's cognitive faculties and the very tangible, visceral terror that people experience when confronted with things they absolutely believe are real and threatening. On that unforgettable day, looking directly into Oneida's sunken eyes, I saw genuine emotion and authentic fear. It wasn't the confusion of dementia or the disorientation of advanced age. It was the pure, primal terror of someone who had encountered something that defied natural order, something that had been slowly consuming her life force for over a century. And I am in absolutely no hurry whatsoever to encounter that kind of terror again, whether in the near future or the distant future. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and my rational mind finally stops its constant chatter, I find myself wondering, what if Oneida was trying to warn me about something? What if It Eats the Years wasn't just the rambling of an ancient mind, but a desperate attempt to communicate a truth so horrifying that it could only be whispered in 4 simple words? What if, in that remote mountain village where time seems to move differently, something truly is feeding on human longevity itself? I may never know the answer, but I can tell you this with absolute certainty. There are some mysteries in this world that are better left unsolved. Now, let's continue with the next story. The first time I saw him, I thought maybe I was dehydrated. I'd been walking for hours along a half-forgotten logging trail deep in the Appalachians, my backpack cutting into my shoulders, the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and my boots kept slipping on wet leaves. But then I froze. Ahead of me, maybe 30 yards down the trail, was a man. He wasn't moving, just standing there in the middle of the path. And he was smiling. Not a casual smile, not the polite kind you give a stranger. It was too wide, too fixed, like his face was stretched wrong. His teeth caught the light filtering through the trees, and his eyes. His eyes didn't blink. For a second, I considered turning back, but the thought of retracing miles alone in the woods was worse. So I did what any hiker would do. I nodded, muttered, "Hey," and kept walking. He didn't move. I passed him, keeping my eyes forward. I could still feel his grin burning into the back of my neck. I told myself he was just some local guy, maybe high, maybe weird. But when I finally glanced back, he was gone. Not walking away, not visible between the trees. Just gone. The woods swallowed sound that afternoon. My footsteps seemed too loud, every snapping twig making me jump. The air was cooling fast, that damp Appalachian chill that sinks into your bones. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd imagined how wrong his smile looked. But an hour later, I heard it. Laughter. It was faint, somewhere off in the trees, but it carried. Not a natural laugh, not amused. It was broken up, jerky, like someone practicing how to laugh but never getting it right. I stopped dead. My throat felt tight, my chest buzzing with adrenaline. I wanted to call out, to say, "Who's there?" But something inside me knew better. Instead, I picked up my pace. The trail bent sharply, and when I came around the curve, my stomach dropped. He was there again, closer this time, standing just a few feet off the trail, his body rigid, head tilted, still grinning. I swear to God he hadn't made a sound coming up behind me. I forced myself to keep walking, eyes fixed on the trail, heart pounding so hard I thought it would echo in the woods. When I was past him, I couldn't resist. I glanced back. He was still there, watching. I nearly tripped because now his smile looked wider. Too wide, like his cheeks might tear open if he kept pulling them back. The trail finally opened into a small clearing where I knew an old ranger cabin was supposed to be. Relief hit me. Maybe I could get inside, maybe there'd be a radio, something. But when I got there, the cabin was just a ruin. The roof had collapsed, windows shattered, moss climbing the walls. It smelled like mold and animal piss. And inside the cabin, on the far wall, scrawled in something dark, were words, "Keep smiling." My stomach flipped. That's when I heard it again. Laughter. But this time it was closer, right outside. I backed into the corner of the cabin, every instinct screaming at me to hide, but there was nowhere. The air was heavy, damp wood pressing in. I clutched my pocket knife, tiny, useless, and held my breath. The doorway was just a shadow framed in green light. And then he was there, the smiling man. He ducked his head to step inside. Same clothes, dark jacket, boots caked with mud, same stretched grin. His eyes caught mine and didn't move away. I whispered, "What do you want?" My voice cracked. He didn't answer. He just started walking toward me, step by step, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. I snapped. I bolted past him, shoving through the doorway so hard my shoulder burned. I ran blind down the trail, branches whipping my face, my chest screaming for air. Behind me, I heard it. Not footsteps, not running, just laughter. Always the same jagged, broken laugh. I don't know how long I ran. The sun had dipped and the woods were drowning in shadows. When I finally stopped, gasping, I listened. Nothing. Just the night sounds, crickets, leaves in the wind. I convinced myself I'd lost him. That maybe he was some crazy hermit who wouldn't leave his territory. But then, up ahead, the trail forked. I hesitated. Left or right? That's when I noticed something nailed to a tree at the fork. A Polaroid, pinned with a rusted tack. It was me. Sweating, wide-eyed, sitting on a fallen log, taken that day, and behind me in the photo, blurry but clear enough, was him, the smiling man. I don't remember choosing a path. I just remember running until my legs gave out and I collapsed against a ridge. My phone finally picked up one shaky bar of service, enough to load a map. I followed it out, stumbling until the woods thinned and lights from a distant gas station bled through. When I stumbled inside, I must have looked insane, mud-streaked, wild-eyed, trembling. The cashier asked if I was okay. I wanted to tell him. I wanted to scream about the man with the smile, the Polaroid, the cabin. But I didn't, because through the glass door of that gas station, across the parking lot, I saw him. Standing by the tree line, still smiling. I left town the next morning. I don't hike anymore. I can't even walk a trail without feeling watched. Sometimes I wake up at night and swear I hear that broken laughter outside my window. And once, when I got the courage to check, there was something taped to my front door. Another Polaroid. Me, asleep in my bed.